Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the third of the IRiQ webinar series. Today we'll be talking about managing unsatisfactory performance. Thank you for joining my colleague Riaan Hanekom and myself as we talk through this topic. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. In Brisbane, here where Riaan and I are located, it's the Yagara and Turrbal people. And we acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. And because we're lawyers, this presentation comes with a disclaimer that this is not legal advice, it is general information. But if you do have any particular concerns or our discussion raises issues for matters in your workplace, you can always reach out to Team IRiQ and we're here to provide you with support. So we'll get started because as usual, we have a packed agenda for our webinar. Ideally, by the end of this session, participants will be able to recognise the early signs of underperformance, understand the difference between performance reviews and managing underperformance and performance versus misconduct, hold effective performance conversations, develop realistic improvement plans, understand the importance of procedural fairness and documentation, and know when to escalate to formal performance management. So why does it matter? Well, I'm sure that each of you who are attending the webinar today or watching the recording can think of a situation in your workplace where one underperforming employee can have a significant impact on the operation of the business, the performance of work and the morale of the entire team. And this happens in a couple of ways. Through productivity, when overall productivity declines due to underperformance that isn't being addressed, tasks take longer, deadlines get missed, and the quality or quantity of work falls below expectations. And it doesn't take long for this to have an impact on the team's ability to achieve its broader goals. In customer service, underperformance flows through to how customers experience your business or services. And that looks like delays, mistakes, inconsistent service, or poor communication, which reduces customer confidence and potentially damages the organisation's reputation. Team morale or the impact on team morale is a significant issue because more often than not, the other team members know when someone isn't performing. And there's nothing worse than feeling like you're carrying others and that expectations are being applied differently across the team. So in those circumstances, underperformance that goes unaddressed can often result in that high-performing employees becoming frustrated or disengaged. And of course, the direct impact on other team members is an increase in their workload, correcting mistakes, following up on incomplete tasks, or taking on additional responsibilities. This can contribute to stress, resentment, and burnout, and can also present a psychosocial hazard in the workplace. But most importantly, I think unresolved underperformance influences workplace culture. What leaders address or don't address can send a very clear message about what is considered acceptable. Addressing underperformance promptly, fairly, and constructively actually reinforces accountability and also gives employees an opportunity and support that they might need to improve. But we know from experience that managers avoid it. And why does that happen? Well, some of the common reasons are here on this slide. Principally, a fear of conflict because these conversations are difficult. Sometimes managers are concerned about how the employee will react or that the discussion might create tension. However, again, we know from experience that avoiding the conversation actually allows the issue to grow. When a respectful, factual conversation early is often much easier than the conversation you inevitably have to have later on. Uncertainty about the process and a lack of confidence can certainly lead to avoiding the difficult conversations, particularly if there's a lack of clarity for managers about what steps to take, about what they can and can't say, and when a more formal process is required. And that uncertainty and lack of confidence leads to delays. We would say seeking advice early, which is prevention is better than cure, and understanding the appropriate process can give managers greater clarity and confidence to act, and can avoid some of the problematic situations that arise. Sometimes managers have limited experience with these types of conversations, and so to support their confidence in that, preparation is important around being clear about the performance concern, having specific examples, and knowing what improvement looks like can make that conversation more constructive. Also having internal policies and procedures that deal with these things are a useful tool for managers to support their confidence in undertaking these conversations. I've certainly been involved in supporting many clients through quite difficult scenarios where trust the process was the mantra, because it's very easy to get sort of sidetracked or sidelined. But when you see the process through, invariably you can have a lot more confidence in the outcomes. And of course, optimism, hoping performance will improve on its own, is sometimes a reason why these conversations are avoided. And it can be tempting to give someone time or hope the issue resolves itself. And whilst employees should be given a reasonable opportunity to improve, they also need to know there's a concern, and that comes through clear feedback. Without that, some employees may not actually even realise that their performance is falling short of expectations. Too many urgent work priorities and not enough time. I think this is one of those scenarios where you create a problem for another day. You're putting off the inevitable, whereas investing time in that early conversation can prevent a much larger issue from developing. In that respect, key message here is difficult conversations rarely become easier by avoiding them. And I'll hand over to Riaan, who'll talk us through a couple of more issues on why this matters.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate the introduction. I think in terms of managing underperformance, probably a helpful place to start as well is just understanding what underperformance is. And if you'll excuse me a fairly infantile example, this is just the example I use to teach myself. I'm a fairly simple person, so simple analogies work best for me. If you tell your child to take the cookie jar and put it in the cupboard in the kitchen, and on the way there, they grab 5 cookies and eat them, that's misconduct. That's not necessarily underperformance. But if on the way there, they accidentally drop the cookie jar, that's a pretty good way of by analogy of saying, well, that's underperformance, or that could be underperformance. So it's performing work not to the desired standard, or they might put it in the wrong cupboard or something to that effect. But the important thing here is the job wasn't performed to the desired level, and you won't always know. Sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between what is underperformance and what is misconduct, when is something misconduct. And that's where where, as Rebecca said, having clear policies, having clear procedures, knowing what to do, it can sometimes be challenging for managers when confronted with a scenario, to know which way to go. And that's also where workplace investigations particularly encouraged. Now, understanding what managing unsatisfactory performance is not, something we often see is sometimes there will be the temptation to conflate managing underperformance and the annual performance review. And it's easy to understand why this happens, and it's easy to understand the temptation of sort of dealing with the approach to dealing with underperformance, or we'll deal with it in the annual performance review. Now, the difficulty with that, as Rebecca said, not dealing with underperformance really sets the culture in your workplace. Often we get questions around, what is workplace culture? How does it take effect? Can you give us some concrete examples of workplace culture? And how, whether you manage or don't manage, and I think that's crucially the thing, whether you don't manage underperformance, that's where workplace culture really comes to the fore. So the goal of the annual performance review is really very different to managing underperformance. The annual performance review, as it is hinted at in the title, is an annual, once a year type of review. It's supposed to be high level. It's supposed to consider the developmental goals of the employee and sort of where they fit into your business. How did you go over the past year? What were some challenges? What can we learn from those challenges? It's very different when you're considering underperformance. Underperformance really is where you have concrete examples of standards that are not being met. And if you're waiting, for to address it in a couple of months' time, you're really setting yourself up for failure. Another thing that we see quite often is comparing unsatisfactory performance to misconduct. Now, if we just think back to the cookie jar, you might not always know for example, if we take the analogy of the jar being dropped, was it thrown on the ground or was it dropped? You might not know. And that's where, again, your workplace investigation will come in. But one is very clearly just an accident, and the repercussions for an accident are obviously much different to when something is deliberate. So the key takeaway here is that the approach you take, depending on which kind of situation we're dealing with, will vary. So as the saying goes, you don't use a hammer to drill in a nail. Same here. When you're addressing misconduct, you do that in a much different way to managing underperformance.
Thanks, Riaan. Okay, recognizing the unsatisfactory performance early.
Look, sometimes it will be usually it'll be easy to see when performance is unsatisfactory, and it's often made easier by having concrete standards. And in services-based businesses, this can sometimes be a bit more difficult. But it's important that when you are able to have clear markers of what is good performance and what is satisfactory performance, that you rely on those indicators. So, for example, as a lawyer, I have key billable hours that I need to meet. If I don't meet them, well, that's a fairly easy and objective metric to measure my performance by. Indicators of underperformance will likely include, the quality of a worker's work dropping off. There'll be increased errors and inaccuracies in the work delivered. They might have their attention to detail might decline. In terms of communication, there might be a failure to respond to emails and messages or requests in a timely way. They may avoid discussions about work performance. That might also be accompanied by a lack of accountability. And the employee might make repeated excuses for not hitting certain targets. As Rebecca mentioned earlier, underperformance can really affect the way your clients see your business, and you'll likely hear from clients or key stakeholders in the business that the employee is just not performing to the requisite standard. In terms of their behavior, they might have a bit more of a reserved or not. They might not appear quite as engaged, and then quite often their productivity will drop off. There'll be increased absenteeism or lateness. They'll withdraw from team interactions. So all of these can quite negatively impact the employees, or are indicators of the employee's performance having been being not satisfactory. All right. Now I'll throw to Rebecca, and Rebecca will talk to us about how to actually manage underperformance.
Okay, thanks, Riaan. So when you have established that you need to manage underperformance, how do you execute that well while managing aspects of employee risk? There is a tendency to think that to be legally compliant, you have to have an overly complex and complicated process for managing unsatisfactory performance. But that's not the case. In fact, keeping things simple can often be the best way to ensure consistency and reliability, which will also lead to legal compliance. Again, having a policy that sets out expectations around how underperformance will be managed is a really useful tool for two reasons. One, because it helps your managers and it guides them in terms of what to do next and what the process looks like. But it also sets expectations for employees, and it sort of communicates to them that you're not being singled out. This isn't special treatment. Anybody who's being underperformed may be, put through the same process. Within your policy, though, you may have a range of escalation points. And invariably, the first point is some early communication through conversations that are not complex and don't have to be overly formal. So let's take a look at a simple 4-step management approach along those lines. Identify, discuss, support, and review. When managers identify underperformance, one of the biggest mistakes they make is simply ignoring it for too long or jumping immediately into the formal process. In many cases, simplicity is key, keeping it simple, and that involves starting with a conversation. The purpose of that first conversation is not to accuse the employee or tell them that they're failing, but it's to understand what is happening and to clearly communicate expectations and then give them an opportunity to improve. Apart from managing employee risk, this also has other benefits for the organisation, because if employees can be retained and their performance can be improved, clearly that's going to be less costly than turning over staff and having to terminate and replace them. So in step 1, identify. Before having the conversation, be clear about exactly what the performance concern is. It's helpful to avoid broad statements such as your performance isn't good enough, you don't seem committed, your attitude seems off, or needs to improve. These statements are subjective and they don't give the employee anything meaningful to respond to or improve. Instead, identifying the gap between what is expected and what is actually happening is more helpful for the employee, and giving examples is a really useful way of doing that. So, for example, the expectation may be that customer inquiries are responded to within 1 business day, and you would inform the employee of that expectation and identify that over the past month, we've had 6 inquiries where the response took 3 or more days. So now you have something specific that you can discuss. So before going into the conversation, the job for managers who are preparing for these conversations, and that preparation is part of having confidence in the process and the outcomes, should be asking themselves, what's the expected standard? Has that standard been clearly communicated? What have I actually observed? What examples or evidence do I have? And have I applied the same expectations to all employees? This is important preparation because we're managing facts and behaviours rather than assumptions about the employee's motivation or attitude. Step 2, discuss. So once we've identified the concerns, we need to have the conversation. And this is often the part that managers find most uncomfortable. A useful principle to apply to the conversation is to be clear but curious. So explain what you've observed and then give the employee the opportunity to explain from their perspective what's happening. So for example, I wanted to speak with you about the turnaround time for customer inquiries. Our expectation is that these inquiries are responded to within 1 business day. I've noticed several recently that have taken 3 or more days. I'd like to understand what's contributing to that. So notice there that we're not starting with blame. We've identified the issue, identified or explained the expectation, and then invited a conversation. Additional questions that can be helpful are things like, can you talk me through what's been happening? Or is there anything getting in the way of meeting that expectation? Or what support do you think would help? And these are conversations that might uncover things that you didn't know about or weren't aware of. Sometimes, for example, an employee may not have been properly trained, so priorities aren't clear, or their workload might have changed, or there can be personal circumstances affecting them. Now, this doesn't mean that the performance issue disappears, and it doesn't mean that we change the performance expectation, but it may change how we respond to it. And so for managers, a useful reminder is diagnose before you prescribe. Step 3, support. So once we understand the issue, we need to determine what reasonable support might help the employee meet the required standard. Like I said, support doesn't mean lowering the performance standards, but it does mean making sure that the employee has a reasonable opportunity to achieve it. And this could include any of the sorts of types of support that are listed on this slide. And what support is offered or provided or sometimes requested will depend on what is causing that performance gap. For example, if the problem is that someone doesn't understand a system, then it's training that might help. If they understand the system but aren't prioritising work effectively, coaching and clearer expectations might be more appropriate. So the central question at all times is, what does the employee reasonably need in order to meet the required standard? And that's something that the manager may be in a position to assess, or the employee may be in a position to request, or something that is discovered as a consequence of this conversation. And step 4, review. And this is a step that managers sometimes forget. So you've had the conversation, you've agreed on what needs to improve, you've offered the support and put the support in place. Now we need to come back and review it and check in frequently enough, again and again. So for example, you might agree to meet after that initial discussion, let's meet in 2 weeks to review how things are progressing. And when you do check in, look for things that are improving. So rather than just looking for what's still not working, if performance has improved, acknowledge it. If there's been some improvement but more needed, it's an opportunity to explain that and potentially set out the pathway to addressing the remaining underperformance issues. And if there hasn't been sufficient improvement, this is the point where a more formal process, like a performance improvement plan, used as a tool, might be more appropriate. That brings us to that escalation point. And the important question is, what happens when we've had the conversation, clarified expectations, provided support, and the performance still doesn't improve? Sometimes our internal policies will tell us, and that's really useful for managers to have that guidance and direction, that the next step in these circumstances is a formal performance improvement plan, for example. And this is where we move from everyday performance management through those conversations into a more formal performance management process. So when an employee doesn't improve following initial conversations and reasonable support, that can sometimes lead to frustration. You might think, well, I've spoken to them 3 times, nothing's changed, what do I do now? And I think it's useful to think about performance management as a progression through these phases on this slide, rather than a single event. Moving through informal coaching where we make things clear, having clear performance discussions, and then moving, if we need to, through a formal performance improvement plan. So the important thing is we don't start at the end, we start at the beginning. There is not necessarily a magic number of conversations that you have to have before something becomes formal, and no magic formula around the type of underperformance. This is always going to be dependent on fact and circumstance. And in this dot point list on this slide here, some of the more common considerations around the decision to move to a formal process are listed. And I think that the seriousness, how serious is it? What impact does it have on the business? I think, or the organisation's performance is a critical question. How long has it been occurring is also critical, but I think that has to be qualified by how long has it been occurring since we had a conversation and supports were provided and efforts have been made to improve. Because there's no point complaining about performance that's been going on for a long time at this point if there's never been an earlier conversation about it. So at this point, though, assuming that you've been through that initial informal process and you haven't seen improvement, the conversation moves up towards something like, we've discussed these concerns previously, and unfortunately the required improvement hasn't occurred. We now need to move to a formal performance management process. And by this stage, this doesn't come as a surprise to the employee. So what does formal performance management look like? Principally, the formal process should make expectations very clear. And in that respect, the conversations you initially had in an informal sense remain relevant around what's the concern, what's the standard, what's required. The employee is already going to be familiar with those things. Important parts of this conversation include how long do you have to demonstrate improvement? How will we assess that, and what happens if that sufficient improvement isn't achieved? This is the pointy end of the conversation, where the signposts are essentially, we're here to support you to improve, but there are going to be parameters around when we say we don't think performance will improve to the required standard in sufficient time to suit the business objectives. And that may lead to, for example, termination on the grounds of poor performance. I think the critical piece is around employees understanding that continued underperformance may lead to further formal action. And just a note on performance improvement plans. So often they are, so a performance improvement plan is a formal structured plan that's documented around, what needs to improve, how that's going to be supported, how it's going to be assessed, etc. So it's documentation around this. Well, it's worthwhile to think of it in this way, that a performance improvement plan is the tool, not the objective. And this is where those initial conversations and regular follow-up are good best practice first step before you get to a PIP. Once you are there, though, a PIP is an extremely useful tool because it creates clarity for everyone involved. Importantly, it should be specific and measurable. For example, rather than say, improve your customer service, it will say, respond to customer inquiries within 1 business day and maintain the standard throughout the 6-week review period. In those circumstances, the employee clearly understands the expectation and the manager has an objective measurement to review that. Review meetings remain an important part of a performance improvement process or a formal management process. So, when a PIP's put together, we don't simply hand it to the employee and say, okay, we'll see you in 6 weeks, if that's one of the timeframes for achievement. Regular check-ins are a really useful way to stay connected to the progress of that performance improvement. And at those regular check-ins, discussing, what's improved, what remains below the required standard, is the agreed support being provided? Are there any new issues or barriers? And what needs to happen before the next check-in? Document those. A note about documentation, it doesn't have to be chapter and verse. It doesn't have to be a transcript of every word spoken, but it should provide a clear record of the concerns raised, the employee's response, the agreed support, expectations, and importantly, what are the next steps around the progress that's to be made and what happens next. So once you reach a point where reasonable expectations have been clearly communicated, appropriate support has been provided, the employee has had a reasonable opportunity to improve, and performance nonetheless remains below the required standards, further action needs to be considered. Depending on the circumstances and the applicable workplace requirements, that could potentially include formal warnings or ultimately termination of employment. Generally speaking, my view is that warnings have very little, if any, utility around improving performance, except if there are behavioural aspects of the underperformance. If the underperformance is a capability issue, I think inevitably after a PIP that's failed, you're going to be considering termination on the basis that the employee lacks the capability to do the job from a performance point of view, and asterisks, putting aside any medical or other issues that might impact performance. So this is the point where managers are usually concerned to ensure that they're following organisational procedures, and where there can be a high degree of concern around termination and employee risk. It's a good point to get advice if you've got concerns about those things. Having said that, the goal throughout the process remains the same: give the employee a genuine opportunity to succeed while ensuring the organisation can reasonably expect the role to be performed to the required standard. The takeaway here is don't wait until you're ready to terminate someone's employment before you start clearly managing their performance. So termination of employment on the grounds of underperformance won't come as a surprise to an employee if the process that I've just discussed is followed. And in those circumstances, termination decision is less likely to be challenged. And I'll hand back to Riaan, who will talk us through some cases on this point. Thanks, Riaan.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think at the outset, it's also useful to consider why are we so concerned with managing performance, and it might sound like a fairly obvious question, or a question with a fairly obvious answer. But I think first and foremost, you've already expended the time in hiring the specific employee. It's almost always more efficient to train that employee to correct their performance and to help them correct their performance, rather than going through the motions of, assuming the process is done correctly, of a termination, and then hiring another person into the role, training them up for it. Firstly speaking, there's an obvious benefit to the business in that sense. Secondly, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, often one of the reasons why managers are reluctant to address underperformance is competing priorities. The perception might be that I just don't have the time to do this. If a half an hour invested early with a clear and kind conversation can save you hours down the line if the process isn't undertaken correctly. And it will almost always be more efficient, provided the employee is willing to improve and applies themselves to that, as opposed to hiring a new person. And this is especially true if you work in a service-based role. So if we look at another point that is very important, is if we do get to the point end of the stick and we have to terminate someone for underperformance, and this is assuming the employee has access to unfair dismissal. One of the questions the Commission has to ask is, if the dismissal was related to unsatisfactory performance, whether that employee or that person has been warned about that unsatisfactory performance before the dismissal. So it's a legal requirement to do so, but I think it's far better to not necessarily just be concerned with the legal requirement, but there's a sincere benefit to the business to addressing underperformance early. Now, we'll look at some cases. Before I do just want to say, if there's nothing else that you take from this part of the presentation, common sense does not exist. There is no such thing. Voltaire said it back in the 18th century. It's still around today, the saying, not common sense, because again, it doesn't exist. So if there's nothing else that you take from this, you'll hopefully see it in some of the cases. But the first case I want to look at is Taylor and CJD Equipment. Mr. Taylor was a regional sales manager. His employer had concerns about his quoting activity, face-to-face customer engagement, and importantly, the quality of those customer interactions. Mr. Taylor was placed on a performance improvement plan, and he was given a a warning, an initial warning, and then a final warning. Some of his performance numbers improved, but the quality of his engagements did not. And so ultimately, his employer terminated his employment. He filed for unfair dismissal or applied for unfair dismissal. And the Commission upheld the dismissal because a fair process was followed. The Commission accepted that the employer could look beyond whether Mr. Taylor had technically met a numerical KPI and consider the overall quality and substance of his performance. He'd also been given clear warnings and a reasonable opportunity to improve. So ultimately, the unfair dismissal application was dismissed. So this is an example of where the employer did it correctly, and it's a fairly long decision as far as unfair dismissal decisions goes. But just at paragraph 138, I think this was pretty good for the employer. The Commission found the process adopted by the respondent was fair. It reached a well-founded decision to dismiss the applicant, which was proportionate to the underperformance in question. So if we consider then perhaps a different case where the employer was not successful, as if you skip down to the outcome, this is a helpful case because the employer conflated and tried to use a number of different concerns. So it had around 16 allegations. Some were misconduct related, some were capacity underperformance related, but the target kept moving. And there were a couple of things concerning about the way the employer handled this case. But one thing that was particularly unfair and detrimental to the employer's case was they had a performance management policy, but they did not follow that policy in determining whether to dismiss Mr. Mullins. So if you are going to have a policy, and it's a good idea to have a policy, but it's very important that you do follow that policy. That's very much the benefit of the policy or the procedure, is that it gives you that certainty of what to do. So while it's a good thing to have, but if you do have one, please make sure that you follow it. That's perhaps another thing that if you take nothing else away from this session, or this part of the session, is if you do have a policy, make sure your managers are trained on it, make sure they follow it consistently and apply it consistently. Now, the other thing that's really important from this case, as I said before, there's no such thing as common sense. So typically if you're someone attending this webinar, and you're in HR, it may be clear to you that if the employee doesn't, pull up their socks, they might be facing termination, but it won't always be clear to the employee. So that has to be made very clear, and the next case will demonstrate that as well. But in essence, simply telling the employee your performance needs to improve, you need to pull up your socks, that's not enough. The warning must identify which aspect of the performance is of concern, also make it clear that the employment is at risk if the performance issue isn't addressed. If you don't do that, you haven't met your obligations as an employer. And as you can see, ultimately, because in this case, because the allegations spanned quite a broad spectrum of events, and because the employer didn't follow their own policy and procedure, the dismissal was held to be unfair, and a sum of $45,000 was awarded, which is pretty significant in an unfair dismissal matter. So very crucially, the warning must identify the part of the performance that must be improved and that the employment is at risk unless it is addressed. Again, common sense does not exist. Nothing is obvious. Nothing is apparent. So if we look at Galway and Vivian Imports, the employee had a significant and sustained shortfall against his sales targets. So his target was around $4 million. His sales target was reduced from $4 million to $2.8 million because of the market conditions, but he only met about 47% of that reduced target. Now, and it was a genuine underperformance, and it would even have been a sufficient reason to find unfair dismissal. But the warnings he was given only said that his performance needed to improve. They never identified that his employment was at risk if it didn't improve. So again, it was probably very apparent to the HR officer and the business that the employee's employment was at risk, but it wasn't apparent to the employee. So at the end of the decision, the Commission says, I accept that the applicant was regularly updated on his sales performance, but he was at no stage advised that the respondent was considering the termination of his employment because of that sales performance. And then just finally, again, an example where it was done properly. In this case, the employee had a history of underperformance and conduct issues, including attendance, safety, quality, and procedural breaches. The employer repeatedly counseled and provided warnings, including final warnings, before the final breach occurred. The question for the Commission was whether the dismissal was unfair, including whether the employer had given a valid reason and had adequately warned the employee about his ongoing performance and conduct concerns. And so ultimately, because they have given him warnings and the warnings were specific enough, the dismissal was found not to be unfair and the application was dismissed. So again, very important, if you are going to give an employee a warning around unsatisfactory performance, it must be coupled with the caveat that their employment is at risk. If the performance does not improve, simply saying your performance isn't good enough just won't cut the mustard. All right. I think that brings us pretty much to the end. Rebecca, was there anything else that you wanted to perhaps touch on?
Thanks, Riaan. I can see that the chat and the Q&A is pretty quiet, which means that we've both done an outstanding job making this topic very clear to everybody. But do send them through if you've got some questions. So we've done very well. Talking through how IRiQ can help. If you're not already connected with us, subscribe to our newsletter. You'll get regular articles and updates in the world of industrial relations and employment law. You can follow us on LinkedIn and you can find us on our website. If you click through the presentation, those links will activate. How can we help? We've got a range of things that we can do. We offer a range of HR support packages as well. So if these are the kinds of things that you'd like to see your leaders and managers trained on, talk to us. We can put something together for you in terms of a package. These links here in the presentation are live, so you can click through those to have a look at the various levels of support that we can offer. And stay in touch. The QR code will take you to our website. Just a note about our next webinar on the 21st of October, Safe Workplaces, what you need to know about meeting your work health and safety obligations. And that will be presented by Joanna Minchinton, our Head of Legal and Consulting, and Riaan Hanekom, our Solicitor. So there will be information on how to register for that on our website now, but if you're connected via our newsletter or LinkedIn, you will also see posts with the links for registration there. The chat function has a little note. Thank you, Chris. We've got some thank yous. Thanks, Chris and team. I hope that was helpful for you.
Rebecca, we do have one question from Martin.
Yes.
Martin's asked that we just talk a bit about show cause notices, whether this is always needed or just best practice.
Always needed, I would say. And I think that's reinforced by some of the decisions that you talked about, Riaan, where the employee needs to have clear notice that the implications for the failure to improve performance include termination of employment. And a show cause is a really useful document for defending a complaint that there was a lack of procedural fairness. Ultimately, it provides procedural fairness because it clearly says this is what we're thinking of doing and this is why, but you have an opportunity to be heard on that. It's important that there be no communication that indicates a predetermined outcome before that show cause. But I would generally say yes, always issue a show cause before a termination decision on any grounds. And the Fair Work Commission decisions, I think, reinforce that. Thanks for the question, though.
Yeah, I think it also gives your business the opportunity to understand what, from the employee's perspective, why there was underperformance, assuming there was underperformance. But it allows you to review your practices and your processes and sort of the way you approach your work, so that if there are any improvements that you can make, ideally you'd find it out earlier than when you're at the sort of the pointy end of the conversation. But if all else has failed and there are some improvements that you can make, that's also a great opportunity to receive those.
Yeah, and look, as a lawyer, I would say this, that I am a big fan of what I call self-serving correspondence, and show causes can have that effect in the sense that it documents the reason for your action. And in an environment where general protections claims are increasingly being used by applicants instead of unfair dismissal applications, a show cause notice clearly articulates what is in the mind of the decision maker before the decision even gets made. So another reason why, it's a really useful tool. You get to effectively create the record and put on the record what the real reasons around a potential decision to terminate are. So again, it's a document that really supports defending decision making. Okay, good stuff. All right, well, we'll end it there. Everybody gets an extra 9 minutes. Go out and enjoy some sunshine if you're in Brisbane. There's a little patch of sunshine. Otherwise, thanks again for joining us. And we hope you can join us for our next webinar on the 21st of October.